All right. Good evening today. Good evening, good morning, wherever it might be you be joining us from. Sometimes there is this world sphere aspect that there's people joining in from many parts of the world. So it could be that you're joining in. It's morning time. So good morning to you, but good evening to us who are welcoming the night. And Gathering in Quarantine is the name of the space, Tertuliando en Cuarentena in buen español. It's an intentional space where we try to dialogue and meet each other wherever it is that we might find ourselves at in our journey. And I think if something I try to do is try to conduct or guide these dialogues as organically as and authentically as I possibly can with our guests. And tonight's guest, joining us from I don't know where. She'll be able to to enlighten us where she might be in geographically in this world. So Lisa Sharon Harper is joining us, and without making a long intro as I usually do, let me just bring her ahead and hit the magic button here, and let's start this great conversation. Welcome. Give me a second, Lisa. Let's see if I don't know if I'm not hearing it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Woohoo!
Yes.
Okay.
I'm gonna read a review.
Okay, I'll do it again. Woohoo! I love technology.
Okay, well, I'm glad to have you here. I'm glad to see you. I'm glad to have the opportunity to interact here for a little bit and share about where we've been, adventures as of the recent days, and something that we like to do here as to kick things off is talk about the current context, and the current context in these times of pandemia. So it's kind of like it's like a bit of a three-legged question.
Okay.
Where were you at geographically? What were you doing kind of like before this whole pandemic thing started, beginning of 2020? And then pandemia hits, how has that affected those endeavors that you were on? And these last 6, 7 months, how has it been? And then also, as a final part of that question, to get your perspective of maybe some observations you've made about society and pandemia, like what things do you think this has brought to the surface about us as human beings? It could be in the United States context,
Mhm.
world context. So what were you doing? Pandemia hits, how has it affected and driven these 6, 7 months? And your observations, kind of like your dissertation about these times of pandemia.
Oh my Lord. You're gonna have to repeat some of those because I'm old.
Sí, no te preocupes, don't worry about it.
Okay. Well, here's the thing. I was actually down in Selma when the pandemic was beginning to take hold in America, and we didn't really know it. We knew it was here. We didn't know how big it was. My first indication that, and I'll go back to Selma, but my first indication that it was here was February 14th. So this is really early. My mom calls me at like 1 a.m. telling me she's rushing to the hospital because she can't breathe. And
Wow.
she has pains in her legs, in her joints, and in her muscles. And she knows it's an upper respiratory issue because she's a nurse. And so it was scary. I mean, it was truly, truly scary. And she rode an Uber, rode an Uber to the doctor. And she sat in the emergency room till 3 a.m. Sat with COVID, most likely, in the emergency room till 3 a.m. I mean, this is a 72-year-old woman.
Wow.
Okay. And I finally called the charge nurse, the one in charge, and I told him, you are going to find a bed for my mom. She is a nurse. You need her. You need her well. And she has served her country. She was at the VA. She worked at the VA as a VA psychiatric nurse not too long ago. And you are going to help her. And so he was like, we're overridden. This is Oakland, California was overridden on February 14th.
At that time.
That's early. Most people are looking toward the end of March to be the time when it took over. But in the Bay Area, they got hit really early. They were among the first hit, actually. And so she ended up spending 2 nights in the hospital, and she had been really sorely dehydrated, So they hydrated her, and I don't know what they did, but basically it was a mild case because it did basically go away. But you know what they named it? They named it a viral phenomenon, or a viral syndrome,
Huh. That was
And they
the
knew
pre-nickname.
that day, actually that day on February 14th, the news had already reported on that day that coronavirus, was now on every continent. On that day, the news reported it was on every continent, but they would not test her to see if it was COVID, because according to the national guidelines, you had to have flown in on a flight from China to be considered.
Wow.
Yes.
Talk about all the people that must have, under the radar, because that was
Yeah.
really.
To this day, not counted. And do you know that my mom, a nurse, she knows this stuff. She tried. She was like, don't you want to know? Like, somebody needs to contact trace me. Don't you? You need to know that I had this syndrome.
No.
Nobody really wanted to know. Nobody would take her information. Nobody came and asked her. She had to fight to get a test.
Yeah.
And she couldn't get a test till like 3 months later. And by then she didn't have it anymore. So it didn't register.
Yeah. Unsurprising, though.
Yeah. So that was February 14th. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, on the 4th and 5th and 6th of March, I was down in Selma for the Jubilee. It's the bridge crossing, remembering, Bloody Sunday.
Yeah.
And Turnaround Tuesday, and then the march to Montgomery. And it was a powerful, powerful time. And I don't think any of us had a sense. I mean, I do remember I was kind of a little bit hesitant. I was like, I don't know. And nobody had masks. Like literally nobody had masks. Yeah. And you had all of these Black people. Like, we are the ones who are most vulnerable to death by COVID, because we enter the hospital already with comorbidities in place, right? So that makes us more vulnerable. Plus, we have more interaction with COVID because we are usually the essential workers, right?
Yeah.
Along with Latinos. And so here we are down in Selma, and we're crowded in with each other in these small rooms. And that was the last time that I flew. Until just recently, I flew recently to be with family in California. But before that, before just recently, I have not flown since the first week of March.
Where are you at now, Lisa?
I'm in DC, where I live.
Okay.
So I live in DC. In fact, today, when the president was airlifted to Walter Reed, I looked out my window to see if I could see him fly by, because normally you can, but I didn't see him today. But that's, yeah, it's we're all right here. So yeah.
So given all this and those brief moments that you share, like early in the year, so early in the year, you're talking about Valentine's Day back then.
Yes,
What kind of like what are some bits of assessments that you've maybe done about this very unique period, at least in 21st century or even 20th century, that we're experiencing for the first time? What are your readings, and what kind of have you been able to discern that tells us and speaks to you about humanity, and maybe specifically in the context of the U.S. America?
Okay, so I think that we are literally in the time of the apocalypse. And I what I mean by that, I don't mean like Jesus coming down again on a cloud. That's not what I mean. But what I do mean is, we are in the time of the revealing. Things are being revealed. We are in the time of revelation. Now, I don't know if it's this end time thing. I don't think so. I don't think so. I also, I always temper that by imagining what it must have felt like for those who lived in the U.S. in 1851 or 1860, like the year before the Civil War began. They must have thought this is the apocalypse too. They must have thought this is the end times. In fact, they really did. The Second Great Awakening literally did think Jesus was coming again soon. And that's right. That's how the awakening happened, right? Like they were like, we got to get clean because Jesus is coming again. So that's imminent. That's why, it's imminent, right? So So I do think that I don't know what God's planning, but I just feel like right now, woo, my God is, let's put the hoods are coming off.
Yeah.
We are beginning to see what has been hidden for at least the last 50 years. We are definitely seeing what has been hidden for the last 150 years since the Civil War. We are seeing the reality that in our nation, we still are fighting a civil war.
Hmm.
I think that the civil rights movement very much understood that. It was they were struggling at the 100-year mark after the Civil War, 1965, right? Like, well, really 90 years to 100 years after the Civil War. It was still fresh for them. It was in the South. They knew they were fighting an extension of that war. They knew that war had not ended. But now we're talking about the North and the Midwest, and we're talking about the whole country. I think that what we see on 2016, when Trump took that podium and said that he was glad to accept, the presidency of the United States, my whole body shook. I've shared this story several times recently. My whole body literally shook. I had no control over my body.
Yeah.
And that does not happen. I have never had this happen before in my whole life. But it shook because I knew what I was seeing. What I was seeing was the White Citizens Council entering the White House.
Yeah.
The White Citizens Council was basically the late 50s, early 60s version of the Klan.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was the Klan inside of government. It was
the mainstream.
Right. It was citizens taking up every level of, literally from the governor on down. That was the White Citizens Council, to the point where when the Montgomery Improvement Association negotiated for better seats for people of African descent on those buses, they didn't negotiate with the mayor. They negotiated with the White Citizens Council. Okay.
Yeah, that's heavy.
That is heavy. So the thing, well, I was thinking about this recently, that when we were back in those days, or even really kind of up to recently, we could look at America and we could say America is a democracy, because the majority of America is a democracy. It's like, we value our vote. We fought like the wins of the civil rights movement. We own those. That the Voting Rights Act was in full play until just 2013. Like we had this. We were moving. Even with Obama in office, we had this. We actually value the law. We value the institutions that protect people's civil rights. We value these things. We are a democracy. We would call ourselves the greatest democracy on earth, right? We were literally the first democracy on earth, actually. And in terms of being a nation state and being a nation that is ruled by laws, not and citizenship is determined by your ability to follow those laws, not ability, but your vow to follow those laws, not by your ethnicity, your ethnic group, right? So we are an experiment in that way. And we were the first, and we would say we are the greatest. But when Trump entered the White House, this is what happened. The White Citizens Council entered the White House. And the thing is, we were surprised by Trump firing, into a crowd in front of the White House and walking across the street and holding up a Bible upside down in front of a church he never attends, right? Yeah. People were surprised at the level of tyranny that they saw. Yeah. And I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of white folk. They were like, what is this? Like, what? How could this happen in America? How could they do this to other white people, right? But the reality is that that's what the White Citizens Council did back in the 60s. You see, Black folk, Latino folk out in the grape fields, like they were fighting that kind of brutality in the 60s. They were fighting that kind of white nationalism, an understanding that this nation was created to be ruled by white people. That's what white nationalism means. It means this is a white nation. And the South fought to keep it that way. That's what the segregationist movement was about. It wasn't about, I don't like Black people, so I just don't want to be down. No, it was about power. It was about the right to keep white space and white rule. But the thing is, now it's not just maintained in the South. It's not just quarantined into the South. It's not contained into the South.
It's all over.
It's everywhere,
It's all over.
everywhere. And one thing we know about that Southern segregationist movement, those whites, they do not care about the law. They don't want democracy. What they want is white rule.
Yeah, yeah, for them to be favored, for them to be favored. Lisa, speaking about the South and speaking about, the history or the forming of a nation. I give a chance to my guests to give a little bit about the forming of themselves, and,
Mm.
and I do it via a question about experiences that you feel were cathartic in your life, informing you as the person you are. So if you
Whoa.
can share briefly, like three moments in your life, or three seasons, three instances, but three memories of specificity, or of a season, moments that you feel are very are critical to making the person with the worldview, with the cosmovision that you have
Mm.
today. So if you can share three briefly moments in your life that
Mm.
you value in that sort of category.
Mhm. Well, wow. I can think of two right off the bat, and I'm gonna have to wait for God to give me the third one. So
Go ahead.
um,
Tranquila.
the first one, actually, maybe this is the third one. So the first one is the reality that I was conceived in 1968, and that was an incredible year.
A
I
lot of
was
things happened then.
conceived, yeah, I was conceived on the day, literally, my mom knows the day I was conceived. Don't ask me why. But I was conceived on the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And the reason for that was because she said she needed comforting, right?
Maya.
So there's a lot of people who are conceived on that day. And so that, and then my mom found out that she was pregnant on the same day. She said she was on a bus when she heard that Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Right. So
Mm.
there's what I've learned are called sovereign foundations.
Mm-hmm.
They are not anything. I didn't do it. This is what God did. These are the things that God plants in our lives that gives us a sense of where we're going, of what God's dream for us was. Well, that's what was going on around my mom's womb when I was gestating. That's what I was birthed into. Um, and I think that, so that's the first thing, is that year was a really major year. It was also a major year for anti-Vietnam protests. And I think Kent State, was that year, or at least one like that. There were major riots that happened in that year. So it was a year of major unrest.
Mm-hmm.
My mom, going backwards, it's not my life, but it does influence my life. So I'll keep that all in this first one.
Mm-hmm.
Was a member of SNCC. She was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And so that definitely influences who I am, because she reared me, right? She's the one who gave birth to me and raised me with the values that I have. There was, and I'm kind of counting all of this all in childhood, right? So from conception all the way to 7 years old. 7 years old, I'm walking around our neighborhood with my mom. We're knocking on doors, and she is asking people, are they planning to vote? And
Wow.
she's the judge of elections in our neighborhood. In other words, it's her responsibility to get people to vote, and also to make sure the vote is good, like it's actually just, it's not tampered with.
Mm-hmm.
So she's walking around, and I'm following behind, and I see all these yard signs for Carter and that kind of thing. And it was Carter versus Ford, 1976. And I remember asking her, why are we Democrats? And she said, and this is one of those, it is one of those markers, right? She said, because my favorite book at the time was Robin Hood. That's something too, I guess. But she said, well, the Republicans steal from the poor and give to the rich, and the Democrats steal from the rich and give to the poor.
Yeah.
So we're Democrats.
That's
We're
a
Robin
perfect
Hood.
explanation. I love that.
Right? Isn't it like so perfect? Oh my God. Right. So it stuck, and I was like, oh, well, yeah, I'm definitely Robin Hood. I'm a Democrat. So I was a Democrat from that point forward.
Yeah.
until I became an evangelical Christian. So I would have to say that the second thing that was most important in my life was walking down that aisle. I literally walked down an aisle at a Sunday evening camp church meeting in 1983. A hellfire brimstone preacher came through town. We had moved a few years before that. Was that? Yeah, 3 years before that, from Philadelphia down to Cape May, New Jersey. And it was there that I was invited to this youth group. And about a year later, I ended up in this Sunday evening camp church meeting after a year of asking, what is prayer? Who is God? Who is this Jesus person? You know, we didn't go to church growing up. My mom was not into that. Turns out, I find out later, she was way into it when she was a child, but she got disillusioned because the church was not dealing with the civil rights movement. The church was silent. So she decided, forget this. She stopped going and she started to get involved in the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
So here I go walking down the aisle, but I'm not walking down the aisle at a Black Episcopal church like she went to. I walked down the aisle at a white evangelical, Sunday evening camp, hellfire brimstone. Every single other person there at this, everybody was white except for me. And, but I was so used to that by the time that didn't really bother me. I went up to the altar with my friend who asked me to go up with her. I had no intention of coming to Jesus, but all the old ladies surrounded me and put their hands on me and started to pray for me. And then I started to weep, and I don't even know why I was weeping. But then I said, okay, I just decided to let go. And it really was a change, a transformation. I literally see my life as pre that altar and after that altar. Mm-hmm. I mean, it literally changed my life. It changed my trajectory. And I would say that the most important thing that it did was it gave me an anchor in life, that everything else can change, but God is with me. I know that.
I guess you were being born again, and I was being born because I was born in 1983.
Oh my gosh. Now get this. Those are some sovereign foundations right there. Because guess what else was born in 1983? The religious right. Hello.
See, I feel very proud about that.
Yeah, the moral majority was literally created in 1983, and that was the flagship of the religious right. And so that's when the whole Supreme Court strategy became a thing. And so I happened to get into this white evangelical world at exactly the time when everybody was, at exactly the time when it all started, the religious right stuff started. So that really did take me on like a 20-year trajectory, actually, because it wasn't until 2003 that, I had some inputs to counter the white evangelical view of the world.
Yeah.
John Perkins was a really very important voice in my development. Dr. John Perkins from Mendenhall, Mississippi, and Jackson, and Voice of Calvary. And his witness as a Black man realizing, after having been beaten to a pulp in a jail, and had a spoon shoved down his nose, right? Because he was trying to organize people. And this is in 1971. This is after the Civil Rights Movement. Yeah. He realized, laying on his hospital bed in Mound Bayou, that he's not going to change the South by converting people. He had thought that if people have Jesus, they'll be good. Right? Yeah. But then he realized the man who shoved a spoon down his throat, down his nose, was a deacon. He was a church deacon.
Yeah.
So he's like, what is this? What is this? So that's when he began to think about what's it going to take? What's it going to take to build a bridge, to heal the South, to turn this around? This is a spiritual war. This is spiritual warfare. And it is also, it's not just about people's salvation. Yeah. This is about their discipleship. This is about them following Jesus.
Education.
Right, education. So anyway, that's the second one. And I would say the third one is that moment that came 20 years later when I went on a pilgrimage, and that pilgrimage literally changed everything. I, at that point, was on staff with a college ministry, and the college ministry, and I was in LA, very, very multi-ethnic environment. Our chapter had everybody up in there. I mean, we Black, Latino, Asian, Native American. I mean, everybody was up in there. And we were asking the question, because the 90s were a pretty, racially explosive time with the LA uprising,
the early 90s,
and yeah, right. And OJ Simpson and others, and Amadou Diallo toward the end of the 90s, and also James Byrd in Jasper, Texas, being lynched by being dragged behind a truck in Jasper, Texas. Hello, right? So this all happened in the 90s. So the church and our organization was really struggling with, how do we understand this thing called racial reconciliation in relationship to the gospel? And it was that question that kind of led us to create a pilgrimage experience for staff, not students, to begin to interrogate our understanding of the gospel in light of history. So we went on this pilgrimage through the Cherokee Trail, along the Cherokee Trail of Tears route. And then we went on a pilgrimage through the experience of African Americans from slavery to civil rights. And both of those stories are very personal for me. My family, according to our family story, went through both of those stories. And so, and also, especially, I mean, the slavery one is like irrefutable because of DNA and all of that, right? So I came to the end of that summer, and I imagined myself, anybody who's heard me speak for any amount of time, for like the last 20 years, actually has heard me tell the story, or 17 years. But it's true. I asked myself, would my third great grandmother, Leah Ballard, have jumped for joy? She was what they called a breeder. They forced her to breed money for her master as a woman.
So they would rape
They raped her so that she would breed people for her master.
Yeah, merchandise,
Yes. And so I asked myself, would Leah jump and shout to know that God has a wonderful plan for her life, but she is sinful and therefore cannot, is separated from God. But Jesus died to pay the penalty for her sin, and all she needs to do is pray a prayer and she gets to go to heaven. Would that make her jump and shout for joy? And the answer that really disturbed me was hell no. Hell to the no.
Yeah.
It's not good enough.
Yeah.
It's not good enough. So that literally led me to a 13-year exploration of the biblical concept of shalom. And it is that concept that guides everything for me now. And it was the impetus, that journey was the impetus for my book, The Very Good Gospel. And that book really does encapsulate how I see the world now. And I think if I were to, say it in a sentence now, what I've come to understand that is the gospel is that we were created, all of us were created by God to live in intricate, interdependent relationships characterized by love. And what that love looks like for us as humans is that we are called to exercise we are created in the image of God. And what that means is that we are called by God to exercise stewardship of this world, stewardship that is in the likeness of God's kind of stewardship. It is characterized by love. And the image of God on earth is supposed to be a marker of where God rules. Therefore, we were created to be markers of where God rules. So when we govern in ways that crush the image of God, we are actually waging war against God. So Leah Ballard was crushed by the American law, the American legal system that crafted this hierarchy of human belonging that we now call race and gender, with the very same laws, the exact same law. The very first race law was also the very first gender law. Hello. You cannot extricate the two in American law. They were created in the same breath for the same purpose, to determine who was created to exercise dominion on this land. That's why they were created here. And Leah's life was determined by that law. Her capacity, her ability to move, whether or not she was going to bear children, was determined by that law.
Yeah.
But the good news is that Jesus, the King of the kingdom of God, came to confront the kingdoms of men that are hell-bent on crushing the image of God on earth because they are warring with God for supremacy. And Jesus has come. That is the good news.
Mira, Lisa, I hear you, and I hear a lot of the very good gospel in what you've been saying. You know, the great part that I was able to read, and I hear, you know, and that the message of stewardship, the message of, you know, taking care of, the message of dominion. I see it, you know, I see it
Yes.
illustrated in the book, and it resonated a lot to me, especially as of these last few years that I've gained. I mean, I personally have been a vegan for close to 7 years now,
Oh, wow. Me too.
and vegetarian for a little bit over 10 years. And it was around the time, I think I became a vegetarian around the time I met you at the Brian McLaren conference back in
Oh
'08. So I
my
was asking those
God.
questions about, you
Yes,
know, like sustainability and
that's
whatnot.
right. The
So
Everything with Change conference. Yeah.
I read that everything was changed. Something and that's so perfectly lined up with this,
Yeah.
with the idea that the direction, the way things are going, it basically indicates that the stewardship that we're supposed to be practicing has been confused for exploitation of resources, exploitation. God has made me in charge, so I can do this or that. And then you'll see patriarchy, you'll see sexism, you'll see racism, you'll see all that. It's part of that
Yes.
tergiversado, that distorted way of approaching that. So when you're establishing or sharing these convictions in your book, and you also go back to your heritage. You also even talk about, you know, like the exploitation of the natives of the land,
Yes.
the indigenous people.
Mhm.
Um, this book that you come out with, that I think Brugman starts off with, that compares that the thinning of the gospel. Can,
Yes.
can can you can you talk a little bit about that? What
Yeah.
does that thinning mean? And
Yeah.
and I'll make a little parenthesis here, and it'll touch with, I want to talk a little bit about Puerto Rico afterwards when you visit there.
Oh,
In
yeah.
Puerto Rico, we talk about salsa, you know, music salsa. We talk about the new salsa, and then we talk about the older salsa, and we call it salsa gorda, which means like fattening salsa, which means the salsa that had like
Yeah.
raw essence. So when we talk about the
Yeah.
thinning of the gospel, I kind of
Uh-huh.
relate it to that. So talk a little bit about that, and maybe talk a little bit about that stewardship message, and go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So, like what I imagined saying to my great, great, great grandmother, Leah, is a white conception of the gospel, basically. It's a 20th century conception that was born in the white evangelical church, specifically in Campus Crusade for Christ, a white evangelical flagship college ministry that came out of InterVarsity. It started with InterVarsity and split off and became Campus Crusade. And there's when you read a book that is actually a compilation of like 50 something books, right? Put
Yeah.
all together. And every single author of all of those books are brown, colonized, indigenous people. All of them.
Yeah.
There is not one person who wrote one word
That was
in
white.
that book, maybe except for David and Solomon. But even David and Solomon, yes, they were kings. Okay, I'll give you that. But they were not kings of an empire. They were kings of a dinky little kingdom that kept getting sacked by empires.
Yeah.
Serially colonized. serially enslaved. That's who they were kings of. They were nothing special. And yes, they wrote a couple of books, but almost the entire book, including David and Solomon, were written by people who were either colonized or in danger of colonization when they wrote it.
Yeah.
So when you read this book, this brown book, this book for the colonized, this book by the colonized, in the halls of empire or at Starbucks, you're not going to understand it. You're going to miss stuff. And that's what happened. And it's funny because for 500 years, we have had established in Christendom that the authorities on what this brown colonized book means are those in European Empire.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is what killed Jesus. European Empire is the force that killed Jesus.
Yeah.
Brown Jesus was killed by European Empire. European Empire then adopts, really co-ops his story and all the stories, and then translates it, interprets it through their empire lens, moves it back to us and says, if you don't believe this, you are a heretic. Oh my God, what? Like for real? Really, for real, what? You know what I mean? So a thin gospel, the thin reading of Scripture is the reading of Scripture that doesn't take the context into consideration.
Yeah.
That does not root Jesus in his people, does not root Jesus in his people's struggles, does not understand that Moses was black. That's why homeboy could blend in with Egypt. And the Egyptians at that time had woolly hair. They didn't have no straight hair. They hadn't mixed in with Europe yet. Europe people were still in caves basically around that time. This is not a white book. This is not written at Starbucks. This is not written in the halls of empire. Empire should have no authority, none, to interpret this text. None. Because it did not come from them. It was not even for them. It was for and by and from brown, colonized, indigenous people. So you can't get a thick read of that text. You can't go deep into that text unless you are sitting there reading it with or reading it as a colonized person. One who has been enslaved, one who has been dominated, because then you will be able to see what the context, how the context shapes the meaning of the text. Otherwise, you're going to miss it. You're missing it.
Do you think, Lisa, that it's gotten to the point that even though that is that is the testimony, that is the prevalent testimonies in there, that it has been twisted so much that when you bring that onto the table, it is almost incongruent because it has been edited or customized to benefit the empire to such a level that to ground break on that causes some people to have a bit of a trauma or be like, whoa, it makes people like kind of like pulling the rug under them. So has the damage, let's call it damage, has damage been done so much that it is observable that when you bring what you just brought up, it is very shocking. It is
people are shocked. Absolutely. But you know what? All you need to do is you need to go to the text. The problem is that in those halls of empire in Europe, hermeneutics were developed that twisted the meanings of the text in order to make them mean what those slave traders, what those financiers of the slave trade, what those colonizers, explorers that then claimed land and killed genocide of native people all over the world, like they read the text and twisted it to mean what they needed it to mean in order to justify the things they were doing. And a lot of their struggle, the European struggle around this text, around the scripture, is where we get the Western church today. Like, the Reformation, and Luther, and Calvin, and all of those movements, even the evangelical movement. The evangelical movement really started in the 1600s as a pushback against Luther, actually, against having too much state control of the church. And so, well, what are you going to do when you know that a movement of the church was born in a context, and they were fighting for something good in that context, fighting against injustice that you can clearly see in the text, that the text does not support. And they actually made moves, but that was a particular movement of the church. It was particular. The evangelicalism, the Lutheran, the Calvinist, the Reformation itself. This is all really good stuff that happened in Europe and makes a lot of sense in Europe. But it's not universal. This is not science. This is story. Yeah. And more than that, it is God. God was not European. So the story, if we're going to thicken our understanding of the text, we have to go back to the context. We have to actually understand what was going on in the world then. How are the political powers aligned? A really great question that my friend Renee August, who is based in South Africa, she's South African, Black South African, she says, you have to ask, or one of the questions that you can ask, one of the lenses, she says, that you can put on in order to be able to see differently, see different things in the text, is to ask, how is power moving in the text? It's a really profound question. How is power moving in a text? One of my favorite questions is, what is the context? Like, so we're just going to focus. That's my lens that I tend to use a lot. What's the context? Because once you understand the context, the meaning shifts, because you have to ask the question, what might the writer have been trying to accomplish with this text? Yeah. Why did they write this? Why did they feel the need to write, "O Theophilus," right? Like, who the heck is Theophilus? Like, what? And you can't know that if you don't know the context. You think Theophilus is a person. It's not. It's the church. It's the people who love God, right?
And it's so important to, this is ABC stuff. But it's not such ABC stuff to some context. I remember hearing, as I grew up in church, the Bible's clear. The Bible is very clear. And like, what is that? What I knew what that meant. Like, you were just supposed to take it for face value, and it would talk about a document that contains within many documents within that's been translated and overly translated. And so there's there's so many like onion layers to be chopped out to get to the core of the core of the core of the core. So at least, when you start that process and you will to it, you kind of like start kind of like that thread that you start pulling out that sweater. Yeah. And then you keep on realizing you keep on pulling more and more and more and more. You're like, when is this going to finish? Because there's so much to be decolonized. Yeah. And I want to make a transition, talking about decolonization,
Wait, I'm sorry, Angel, before you do that, can I just say what
see.
So come back to what you're saying, because I do want to do that. I want to go there. But another thing that we need to make sure we understand is that this text was written in actual language. It's not some language that can't be discerned. It's an actual language that we know how to translate. Yeah. Ancient Greek, ancient Hebrew, Aramaic. These are three languages that are translatable. So anybody who writes anything, if you're going to write it down, you want it to be understood, basically. Even if it's poetry or song, you want people to understand it on some level, right? So when we go to the text, I come with the fundamental belief that this is understandable. Sorry, that's my neighborhood. I don't know if you can hear that.
It's a good soundtrack.
Yeah, right. So they always need they need attention. So there you go. Like, we want to be part of the podcast too. So when we come to the text, we have to come with the understanding that these writers wrote this so that it could be understood. It is
Sure.
understandable. We have to do the work. And that's what we do. What we don't do, we throw our hands up and go, "Oh, it's too mysterious. Oh, it can't be known. Oh, it's been translated too many times." No, it's still the Greek and the Hebrew and Aramaic.
No.
Get a Strong's, like, you know what I mean? If you need to go basic, get a Strong's concordance, and it'll tell you what each word means, every single one of them.
Yeah.
So you can go back and at the very least see in a general sense what the original meaning was that the writer was
Claro.
trying to convey.
Lisa, like you recently, I don't know if it was pre-corona that you made a visit to Puerto Rico,
See?
and I remember talking a little bit with you as you were there,
Mhm.
and I remember you went to Loíza, and speaking
Yeah.
about decolonization, speaking about colonization, like I come from Puerto Rico. I was born and raised there.
Mhm.
My heart is always there, even when I am now in the diaspora in Estados Unidos in the U.S.
Mhm.
Um, what did that visit do for you? I know you were there for a bit, and I know you met some bomberos and
See?
and artists. So tell us a little bit about that visit, and talk a little bit about decolonization, and maybe kind of like attach a little bit of that to that trip, and kind of like how you went into that trip and how you left that trip.
Yeah. Well, I went into the trip. I knew that I needed to go and booked the flight and went with my friend Liz Rios, and her husband Hiram, and we had a great time. And we did it. I knew I needed to do it because I needed to do family research for my next book. And also just for me, like I wanted to go and walk on the land where my own ancestors lived. They lived I thought they lived in Loiza. They didn't. They lived on Loiza Boulevard, Loiza Street, Loiza Calle.
Santurce or
Sí. So in Santurce. So what you have is you actually, but we didn't know that. So we booked I didn't know that at first. We booked our Airbnb in actual Loiza. It was like right there. And
wonderful.
that was like so fabulous. And then we finally asked somebody, where would this be? And they were like, "Oh, that's in San Juan." And it's like a neighborhood in San Juan. I was like, "Oh my gosh." So we the first full day that we were there, we found um, the house. I think it was like a red house that was on our yellow house on the side of the road. And this house is the house in Loiza where the artists really hold the story. So
Mm.
we sat down with them, and I don't know if you followed it that day, but we actually did a Facebook Live with them where they were teaching us bomba, and
See.
oh, so good. But what I learned about colonization was I learned that the people of African descent, first of all, and I've even learned this since then, that the first Africans, the very first Africans to be brought across the transatlantic were brought to San Juan.
Yeah.
I didn't know that before.
Yeah, Bob Marley speaks about it a little bit in Buffalo Soldier. He talks a little bit about that.
Oh, wow. Well, that's and I want to make it clear. That's what when we say that, we're talking about enslaved Africans. We're not
Mm-hmm.
talking about free explorers who actually did come earlier, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but the very first enslaved Africans were brought to San Juan, and Loiza was this place where it ended up being the largest port that brought in uh, enslaved Africans into Puerto Rico. Now, the interesting thing about this, I'm still processing actually, and what blew my mind was the difference between the kind of colonization and enslavement that happened by the English and the Spanish
Mm-hmm.
and the Portuguese, right? So the Portuguese were Brazil, the Spanish, of course, Puerto Rico, but the English colonized St. Kitts and Nevis. The English colonized Barbados, right? So the kinds of enslavement that happened on those various islands and throughout the Caribbean and South America were very different depending on the nation that did the colonizing, right? So what I found, this I learned through a conversation with Elizabeth Conde Fraser, with Dr. Elizabeth Conde Fraser. She explained to me, she was the first person to tell me about Loiza, and that's why I even knew to go. But she said, your ancestors probably lived in Loisa. And I said, why? She goes, that's the place that that people of African descent, former enslaved people in surrounding Caribbean islands, flooded to after their islands had abolition, after slavery, because there was great poverty all over the Caribbean because the slave trade had fallen and other trades hadn't come up yet. So
Yeah.
everybody was island hopping in order to try to find work. And when I go back into my own ancestors, like census records and other records, you can see them. They are on all of the islands in different years. In fact, I really do believe that several of my ancestors' uncles, like great uncles, were all together in Panama helping to build the Panama Bridge because
Wow.
they are there in Panama at the time that the bridge is being built. But they're not from Panama, but everybody was trying to find work.
Yeah.
So it turns out that my great grandfather and great grandmother, Anita Richardson, no D, Richardson, and oh my gosh, I'm blanking on my grandfather's name. How was that?
Tranquila. You'll forgive
I
me.
hate when it happens. It's like, oh, you always. Anyway, my Ricardo. Reynaldo. So Reynaldo,
Right.
thank you. Reynaldo and Anita, they got married, and they got married in Santurce. And we went to Santurce. We walked around, and we were trying to find the land that they lived on because there was an actual address. We had an address, but that address doesn't exist anymore. But we did go on this walking tour, and we found pictures of Santurce around the time
Back then.
that they were there. And you know what it was? It was swampland. They lived on top of a swamp. And I didn't realize that. I was like, wow, that is humbling. But that's where you have, like, Puerto Rico invited people of African descent in, but then pushed them to the very margins and only gave them the swamps to live on.
Yeah.
Because the anti-Blackness is real. It was real then, it's real now. I felt it when I was there.
Even to the day.
I felt it. I really did. And so Loisa was this like oasis. It was this place where blackness rules. And another thing, so one other thing I found, and this is really cool. So I found that talking with the men who carry the bomba, right? They are the keepers of the bomba and also the keeper of the masks, right? So they have this festival that goes on every July and August, but definitely throughout the July. And it has several characters that like march through the streets. Yeah. And the outward folklore is that it represents Jesus and Mary and Joseph and they're doing the and that's what they told the plantation owners. This is Jesus and Mary and Joseph and and they do the dance and the masks and
but in reality
it's Shaka Zulu.
Yeah, it's their own spirituality. Yeah,
it's their own. In reality, it is. But the Shaka Zulu thing is important because it is the one warrior in Southern Africa that actually beat back colonization.
Yeah, fought back. Yeah,
it fought back. He ultimately lost, obviously, but still, people looked up to him and they saw him as this warrior spirit. And what they did was they incorporated the hero. They made Jesus the Shaka Zulu. They understood that Jesus was the Shaka Zulu of their people. And he is marching in the beat of Shaka Zulu. He is going to save the people. What? I was like, see, this is thick faith. Yeah. That's thick faith. That is an understanding of Jesus that most white people they don't have, because Jesus was, just a carpenter who decided to get on the cross and die for my sins.
Mira, Lisa, as we arrive to the last bits of this conversation, I think it's I mean, just being able to to hear those stories, and specifically the last one you just shared about understanding not only the validity of the spirituality of then of these people that probably had a better comprehension of the gospel that we do, without explicitly knowing it, without, because there's substance. And I had here Samir Selmanovic some time ago, and he talks a little bit about that, the substance of Jesus and all that. And
Mhm.
I'm also thinking about agua ybana in the Taino tradition, like when the
Yeah.
Spanish arrived in Puerto Rico, and also that presence of resistance,
Mhm.
of even though you're outnumbered, or even though you still fight for what you know, what you claim to be right. And I think that legacy, even though so long ago, we can still hold it present. And I think it's fabulous. And you see that very well alive in Loisa. You see
Mhm.
that very well alive in Loisa.
Mhm.
Um, as a final question, Lisa, I like to talk about utopia. I like to talk about our utopias, and there's a
Mhm.
reference to, I believe, Chilean author. It's a story not of his, but he shares about the utopia as a reference point. The utopia as, what is the
Yeah.
purpose of utopia? You take 5 steps, and it takes 5 steps. You take 10 steps, and it takes 10 steps. It's unattainable. So what is then the point? Well, the point is then to keep on moving forward. You keep on keeping on. So for you, Lisa, as a final question, what are those utopias that allow you to keep on moving forward, even in the midst of kind of some of these shitty times that we're living
Yeah.
in? So what
Yeah.
is those utopias that allow you to keep on mobilizing and moving forward?
My understanding of the vision of shalom is my utopia. And it is, but I actually really do believe in it. I don't think it's going to keep moving forever. I think it's going to come. I think that it comes when God comes. It comes wherever God is. It comes wherever love reigns, actually. It comes in shadows, but it comes. And um, on in the first paragraph of the Bible, um, I was sitting there and I was studying to write chapter 2 of the Very Good Gospel, and I was asking myself, who wrote this thing? Now, there's all these theories. There's either Moses or the four, and blah blah blah. And I was, investigating the theory that it was the Babylonians, and I think it is because it starts very much like, echoing the story of Tiamat and Marduk, and the creation story of the Babylonians.
Mm-hmm.
And Tiamat lived in the deep. That's where Tiamat lived. And Tiamat made a bunch of sea monsters, hello, right, in order to come and to war with her children who were trying to war with her for supremacy. But Marduk rose up and said, if I win, then I get to be the supreme God, right? So this is the story of their captors. This is the
Yeah.
story of of their of the ones who have enslaved them for 70 years. And here in the first paragraph, we have this. It says, in the beginning, when the supreme God, hello, it's not just God, when the supreme God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. Now, that word darkness, when you translate it, it's all the D words. It's desolation covered the face of the deep.
Mm.
It's destruction covered the face of the deep. And I was like, whoa, this is a lot deeper than I thought. This is a lot thicker than I thought, right? This is not about how many days the earth was made in. That's a
No.
thin reed. No, this is actually about something. It's about, they are making commentary on the worldview of their oppressors. That's what's happening here on their way out. And the darkness, maybe what they have experienced, their time in Babylon, as a desolation, as destruction. And then I remembered, back in Psalms, there is a passage about that Babylonian siege, where it said that babies' heads were dashed against the rocks. This
Yeah.
was trauma. This was desolation. They lost their freedom I understand something about this. Something in me is resonating with this. My ancestors who live inside me in my actual DNA were like, ooh, we get this. Now, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters, that wind, first of all, it's a feminine word, that wind from God, the ruach of God. But it's not swept. The word is not actually swept like that. It's hovered. And the hovered word actually means hovered like a hen broods over her
Her
chicks.
chicks, yeah.
So God, the Spirit of God, is hovering over the waters. God's going to birth something. God is going to war. God is going to war to save God's people from enslavement to a nation that came in and colonized them. And the way that God, Ruach, female God, goes to war is to brood, is to give birth to something, to give birth. And God, how does God give birth to something? How does God go to war against Tiamat, against Marduk, against the gods of those who had enslaved them? God says, let there be light. And the light cuts the darkness. The light limits, it cuts the darkness so that the darkness does not and cannot win. Darkness never wins against the light. But notice that God does not eliminate the darkness. God has both in their proper space and time. But one thing we know is that even in paradise, there was destruction and chaos and desolation. In paradise, there was the deep, which is chaos. But God limits the chaos with the land. God limits the destruction with the light. And God is with us. And so we can walk up to the sea monsters and go, hey, that's really good. We don't have to be afraid. So utopia for me is not a place without chaos or without destruction, without darkness. Utopia for me in the scripture is a place where God is in the midst of it all. And so therefore we can have peace.
Lisa, gracias. I have enjoyed this tertulia with you, and I hope it's the same with everyone who participated and who saw or who may see afterwards is recorded. So, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. A true honor. Thank you.
And so, everyone, we will see each other next week. Don't disconnect just right away. I want to say goodbye to you behind the scenes, and I'll see each other with you. Meet everyone next week in the Próximo Tertuliando. And I always like to close off with good old Walter Mercado, a former Puerto Rican astrologer who has a Netflix documentary on him, on his life called Mucho, Mucho Amor. He used to close a segment saying, que tengan mucha paz y que tengan mucho, mucho amor. So people, see you around next week. Ciao.
Ciao.